Morning, everybody. Welcome to the Hope Daily. Today we're going to be looking at Psalm 44 together and looking at what it can say about righteous suffering. So, last two Fridays we've had two Psalms, 42 and 43, brought to us, and this is the third one in a kind of series of Psalms written by the Sons of Korah. Tim mentioned a couple of weeks ago that the Sons of Korah were the worship leaders of Israel. They were a whole group of people who were both the worship band and also the doorkeepers to the temple. And so their job was to often write and compose these psalms for the people, and they would be performed at worship services and collective festivals and such and so forth. So the last two Psalms, 42 and 43, were very much personal psalms, talking about personal anguish and that personal response to God. Psalm 44 here is a collective lament. So it's kind of talking about the situation they're in as a whole people. So the psalm itself is split into kind of three sections. First section looking at the past, the majority of the psalm looking at the situation they're in now and where they are, and then finally moves to the future and basically asking for help from God. So I'm going to take it in those three sections, and we'll read each section each at a time, and then sort of explore a bit deeper into the text as we go. So let's start with verses 1 to 3. So it starts off, "We have heard with our ears, O God. Our fathers have told us what you did in their days, in days long ago. With your hand you drove out the nations and planted our fathers. You crushed the peoples and made our fathers flourish. It was not by their sword that they won the land, nor did their arm bring them victory. It was your right hand, your arm, and the light of your face, for you loved them." So the first three verses here, as I said, we'll start looking into the past, and they're sort of recalling the works of God that has happened long ago, generations ago. So it's not something that they remember themselves, but stuff that's been passed down through the generations, all the way back from the time of the Exodus, when God basically gave them their new land. And we read about that in Exodus and further back in the Old Testament. And so it starts off by acknowledging how great God is, how wonderful he was to them, his great deeds, and the fact that the only reason they got the land that they were was because of him. It wasn't by any action that they did. They could have just stood back and did nothing, which effectively they did. And God effectively handed them their land. He crushed the people, pushed away the people that were there, and basically led his people to the land that he wanted them to have. And like now, we can all remember, or we've heard stories of what has gone in the past of our own kind of family or our own church or traditions, that we hear how great God has been to them. And so it's kind of that whole tradition of passing down the stories of how God has been great to us. And then in verse 4, it moves on from the kind of distant past to more of an immediate past. And it starts off, so in verse 4, "You are my King and my God, who decrees the victories for Jacob. Through you we push back our enemies. Through your name we trample our foes. I do not trust in my bow. My sword does not bring me victory. But you give us victory over our enemies. You put our adversaries to shame. In God we make our boast all day long, and we will praise your name forever." So now we're looking at kind of more immediate future, immediate past. And it switches from a kind of a we to a me and a my. So we switch from kind of a collective third person to a singular person response. So the commentaries that I read kind of suggest that this psalm was written at a time when the people had undergone a really bad defeat, a humiliating defeat by their enemies. And this was written as a collective lament about that whole defeat. And the idea was that it was sung or read by either the king or the commander of the army. So it's kind of switches between us as a people and also the king taking responsibility as the leader. And so where it says here in verse 4, you are my king and my God, that is the kind of the king or the leader talking about how God is his God. And he is talking on behalf of his people. So we've switched from being a distant past to a more present past, so a more immediate past, things that they've actually experienced themselves. They've experienced God's hand on their lives during their own lives and the victories that he's given them in what they've done. And then in verse 9 it switches to what's happening now. So this is the kind of the meat of the whole reason why we're singing the song, the meat of the reason why they've written this psalm and their current situation. So we're looking at verse 9 to 16. But now you have rejected and humbled us. You no longer go out with our armies. You made us retreat before the enemies, and our adversaries have plundered us. You gave us up to be devoured like sheep. You have scattered us amongst the nations. You sold your people for a pittance, gaining nothing from their sale. You have made us a reproach to our neighbours, the scorn and derision of those around you. You have made us like a byword among the nations. The people shake their heads at us. My disgrace is before me all day long, and my face is covered with shame, at the taunts of those who reproach and revile me, because of the enemy who is bent on revenge. So it kind of a very stark switch from being, wow, you're a great God, you've done fantastic things for us, you basically won the war for us, as long as you were on our side, then the victory was bound to be ours. There was no way we could have gone out with cucumbers in our hands and we would have still won the war. To the situation now where it feels like God has completely abandoned them, that he's basically switched sides. Instead of fighting for them, he's now kind of fighting against them. He's abandoned them completely, and they feel like they've been, left all them on their own, led out to be sort of like slaughtered amongst their enemies, and where they would expect God to be there fighting for them, they found themselves completely on their own, outnumbered, outmatched in every way, and completely defeated. And it talks about how they were scattered amongst the nations. So maybe this particular defeat, the enemy actually captured some of their people, and then obviously then took them away from their own families. It talks about how they feel like they've been sold for a pittance and gaining nothing from their sale. So it feels like they've been sold into slavery, and God hasn't even made a profit on the sale. He's kind of sold them at less than retail value. That's how worthless they feel in the eyes of God. And it just is, the language is very much, you really get that sense of despair and depression, and kind of just can't understand how things have been so good and now they're so bad. And I'm sure that can resonate with lots of us at times. So there have been times in our lives where things have really felt like we're on a high, all's going fantastically well, and then suddenly something happens and it kind of it drops down, and you just feel like it can't get any worse. This is the worst of it. And this is how the people are feeling at the moment. They feel just completely abandoned. Whether God had abandoned them or not, probably not, but this is how they feel. And they talk about how they feel shame and revile, and they feel like everybody's looking at them and laughing at them. So they held themselves out as this great nation, and then suddenly they've had this great defeat, and now all their neighbours are looking over the fence going, ha 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 ha, yeah, you're not so good now, are you? And sometimes it can feel that way. As God's people, we tell people we're Christians and we're God's people, and when bad things happen, it can sometimes feel like people are looking at us and going, "Well, you see, it's not that good, is it?" And that's what they feel like. And even when it switches again to say, my disgrace and my face is covered with shame, the king himself or the leader is feeling that shame himself. Maybe it was his tactical error. Maybe he made a complete mess up of the situation in terms of the war or the battle, and he feels kind of personally responsible for the defeat. And he feels, and it might be that even his own people are looking at him and blaming him for what happened. And then verses 17 to 22, it kind of switches into, they can't now understand why this is happening. So they're trying now so this has happened, we're in a bad situation, and now they're trying to rationalize, why is this happening to us? And so from verse 17 it says, "All this happened to us, though we had not forgotten you, or been false to your covenant. Our hearts had not turned back, our feet had not strayed from your path. But you crushed us, and made us a hoard for jackals, and covered us over with deep darkness. If we had forgotten the name of God, or spread out our hands to a foreign god, would not God have discovered it? Since he knows the secrets of our heart, yet for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered sheep to be slaughtered." So now they just don't understand why this has happened. They certainly believe that they've kept the law, they've kept the covenant, they've not sort of gone away and worshipped foreign gods, they've not done anything against what God wanted them to do, and yet this has happened to them, and they just don't understand it. When I first read this, and this particular passage, I was thinking, well, maybe they just didn't know they'd done something bad. Maybe they were just pleading innocent. I didn't do it. It wasn't me. But then I kind of read it further, and read some of the commentaries, and certainly I don't think that's the case. I really do believe that at this time the people thought that they were really following God's law and they were doing the right thing as a people. I mean, obviously, individuals, we all sin, we all do things wrong, but as a people, they were actually following God's law. They were doing what they're supposed to do. The Old Testament, when you're reading the Old Testament, you do tend to find that it's a kind of a story of the people do something good, they get rewarded, they then do something bad, and they get punished. And it has to be the Old Testament very much a cycle of that kind of turn away from God, something bad happens, come back to God, and then it all goes okay again. And so there are not many stories in the Old Testament, I don't think, where we see this righteous suffering. So where things go bad, even though everything's good and you're doing the right thing, you couldn't do anything better, and yet still it all goes terribly wrong. There's a cross-reference here with the book of Job, who had a similar situation. He was a righteous man, he did all the right things, everything was going well, and then suddenly it all went downhill for no reason, just because it happens. And that righteousness that they felt they had, it's all gone because something's just gone completely wrong, and they just don't understand why. Which I guess also then goes on to explain why they feel so bad about the situation. I mean, the thing is, when you do something bad and you get punished, then you can understand it. It's kind of, okay, I did something, it's all gone wrong, fair enough. Suffering and pain and things going wrong feel worse when you know you've done nothing wrong. So when you know you're innocent and yet still things happen, I think that defeat, that pain, that suffering always feels worse, because you feel in your heart that I don't really deserve this. It's not right, it's not just, but it happens, and it's happened, and it feels horrible. So just like Job, who was faithful to God, the people of Israel here were faithful to God at this time, and yet God allowed them to be defeated, and it feels like that they've just been abandoned by God, and they don't understand why. And so they talk about how God's just abandoned them. He's let this terrible defeat happen. People have been taken away. Probably a few people have died. They've been taken away from them, and they just don't understand why. And yet there's this wonderful verse in 22 that kind of says, "Yet for your sake we face death all day long, and we're considered sheep to be slaughtered." So even though they kind of understand towards the end here that we're doing what we can do, and yet we're still facing death, and that's sometimes what we as Christians have to do. As we do the right thing, we follow the rules, we do the best we can, we follow God, and yet we will suffer. Things will happen. Things won't always go as we plan. Things won't always go well, and quite often we won't understand why things have gone bad, why things have gone horribly wrong, and yet they still do. And as Christians, we have to understand that will happen, and we will face, as they say, we will face death for the sake of God. And Jesus, when he spoke, he made it abundantly clear that that would be the case, that as followers of him, we would face death and persecution and hatred and ridicule just for his sake. And then finally, we look from verse 23 as the kind of looking ahead now. What's the response? What should we do? What can we do? And in verse 23 it starts, "Awake, O Lord, why do you sleep? Rouse yourself, do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our misery and oppression? We are brought down to the dust, our bodies cling to the ground. Rise up and help us, redeem us because of your unfailing love." So even though they're feeling horrible and they're feeling depressed and terrible, they still are calling out to God for his help. They still understand that God loves them, and at some point he will help them. The prayer is that, wake up, Lord. It's not that God's asleep, but kind of asking for his action, because they understand that there's nothing that they can do to change what's happening. There's nothing that they can do to help. All they can have is an attitude of praise, an attitude of worship, an attitude of godliness in some ways, that they call out to God because they know that he's the only one who can do anything to change the situation that they're in. And so they call out, and we are brought down to the dust, our bodies cling to the ground. There is no lower that they can go. They're right in the ground, they're in the dust, they're buried into the ground. They can't go any further. We're at our lowest point, and only God can lift us up and redeem them. And so there's this kind of heartfelt plea of help. And when we find ourselves in that situation, when we find ourselves in a situation of suffering, pain, then our only response is to cry out to God, because at the end of the day, he's the only one who's going to be able to do anything to help the situation. And all we can do is have that attitude of godliness, that attitude of he is the one who can help. And with hope in our hearts and faith, then we pray that the Lord will be able to help us and bring us out of the situation that we're in, just as the people here prayed to God that he would redeem them and he would rise up and help them. And that's the end of Psalm 44. I hope it's spoken to you. Please write anything in the comments, and I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.